So this was the big story. Kidnapping is so we found out that Obama, Trump, and Biden are in on this, right? And that the Trump administration was literally talking about and trying to find ways to kill Julian Assange. It says kidnapping, assassination, and a London shootout inside the CIA's secret war against WikiLeaks. Discussions over kidnapping by the way, this story was pretty much written by Max Blumenthal in the Gray Zone in May of 2020. It took Michael Isikoff and the rest of these guys a year and a half to catch up to the Gray Zone. Discussions over kidnapping or killing Assange occurred at the highest levels of the Trump administration, said a former senior counterintelligence official. There seemed to be no boundaries. Senior officials inside the CIA and the Trump administration discussed killing Assange, going so far as to request sketches or options for how to assassinate him. This is real. Pompeo and others say the agency proposed abducting Assange from the embassy and surreptitiously bringing him back to the United States via a third country, a process known as rendition. Okay. One of the officials said he was briefed on a spring 2017 meeting in which the president asked whether the CIA could assassinate Assange and provide him options for how to do so. So let's remember, first of all, give me a bunch of options. Formal, informal, cheap, expensive, something with flowers, something without, cannoli. I want options. But this at the same time as Trump was trying to find out a way to assassinate Assange, my old employer, the Young Turks, were smearing him as working for Assange, as working for Trump. That's how deranged people who are Democrats are. The conversations were part of an unprecedented CIA campaign directed against WikiLeaks and its founder. The agency's multi-pronged plans also included extensive spying on WikiLeaks associates, sowing discord among the group's members, and stealing their electronic devices. It's a pretty familiar playbook, by the way. There was a reticence in the Obama administration at a high level to allow agencies to engage intelligence collections against WikiLeaks, and that changed in 2013 when Edward Snowden, a national security agency contractor, fled to Hong Kong with a massive trove of classified material, some of which revealed that the U.S. government was illegally spying on Americans. In the wake of the Snowden revelations, the Obama administration allowed the intelligence community to prioritize collecting on WikiLeaks. The CIA assembled a group of analysts known unofficially as the WikiLeaks team in its Office of Transnational Issues with a mission to examine the organization. Still chafing at the limits in place, top intelligence officials lobbied the White House to redefine WikiLeaks as some high-profile journalists as information brokers, which would have opened up the use of more investigative tools against them, potentially paving the way for their prosecution. Among the journalists, some U.S. officials wanted to designate as information brokers were Glenn Greenwald, then a columnist for The Guardian, and Laura Poitras, a documentary filmmaker who had both been instrumental in publishing documents provided by Snowden. In a statement to Yahoo News, Laura Poitras said to classify herself, Greenwald, and Assange as information brokers rather than journalists are bone-chilling and a threat to journalists worldwide. I am not the least bit surprised that the CIA, a longtime authoritarian and anti-democratic institution, plotted to find a way to criminalize journalism and spy on and commit other acts of aggression against journalists, Greenwald said. And I just want to show you this video to show you this was the guy in charge of lying and targeting Glenn and targeting Julian Assange.
What's the cadet motto at West Point? You will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. I was the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. It was like we had entire training courses. It reminds you of the glory of the American experiment.
So let me bring in Glenn again. Glenn, what is your response to the revelations that you were targeted? They wanted to change you from a journalist to an information broker so they could go screw with you.
So, as I said in that quote, it's the opposite of surprising. It would be surprising to me if the CIA hadn't been doing that, not just against Julian, but also against myself and Laura. At the time of the reporting in 2013, people, I think, either didn't know this or have forgotten that what happened was I went to Hong Kong to meet with Snowden. I spent roughly 2 weeks there. That was when we began publishing the first 5 or 6 stories. It was when we unveiled him to the world. in a video interview, and it became obviously the biggest story, biggest news story in the world. And my intention was to travel back to Brazil by first going from Hong Kong to New York, doing a bunch of media, going on TV shows, talking to the American public about what these revelations signified and why they were so important and why we were doing what we were doing and what our intentions were. And then to fly back to Rio de Janeiro, where I lived at the time and still do. And my lawyers at the time that were provided by The Guardian, who were very, very closely connected to the highest levels of the Obama Justice Department, the kind of people who could pick up a phone and call and get Eric Holder on the phone, who had worked with him in law firms and the like, warned me very strenuously not to do that. They said they thought that was extremely dangerous and ill-advised for me to go back to my own country because of the risk that very likely I would at least be served with a subpoena and perhaps even arrested, that this is what they were hearing from inside the government. When you hear that from your own lawyers, you take that seriously. So I avoided the U.S. I flew back to Brazil through Dubai. And for the next year, I did not leave Brazil because the U.S. government, publicly and privately, were threatening us with arrest. James Clapper, who now works at CNN and was the person who kind of prompted Snowden to come forward in the first place when he went to the Senate and denied illegally by lying that the NSA collects huge dossiers on millions of Americans when Snowden had in his hand the evidence that he did exactly that, the NSA did exactly that, would constantly refer to us not as journalists, but as aiders and abettors of the fugitive or participants in this crime ring, clearly trying to lay the foundation for us to be prosecuted and classify us as something other than journalists. Remember that as well, my husband was detained by the British government when he flew to Germany to meet with Laura because I couldn't, to pick up a part of the archive that had become corrupted and that she fixed. And when he was flying back to Brazil through Heathrow, he was detained under a terrorism law for 11 hours, threatened with prosecution, only allowed to leave when the Brazilian government made an enormous diplomatic scandal about it. And the whole time I had been hearing from journalists, from people inside the government, from my lawyers, that they were very serious about trying to potentially prosecute us. And that's why, Jimmy, nothing makes me sicker than watching over the last 5 years the Democratic Party venerate this agency that has done nothing but, kill people and assassinate dissidents and kidnap people and overthrow democratically elected governments, all while pretending to be so offended that Russia put up a few Facebook bot pages and Twitter bots as though that kind of interference compares in any way to the massive crimes that the CIA has been committing. It additionally makes me sick to listen to the Obama administration or the Biden administration pay homage to the vital importance of a free press during the Trump years when I knew that the CIA had been doing this. They prosecuted Assange. The Biden administration is responsible for Julian Assange, arguably the most important journalist of our generation in the Western, part of the world, to be rotting in prison. And so, a lot of it is vindication because we did know about it at the time. I'm glad that it's finally reported. The other thing I would say is when I was criminally prosecuted, when the Bolsonaro government tried to indict me last year because of the reporting that I did here in Brazil based on a large archive, that is the theory that they use. The justice minister, Bolsonaro's justice minister, Sergio Moro, who was the target of our reporting, I remember he testified early on in the reporting for 9 hours in front of the Brazilian Senate. And every time my name came up, he would only refer to me as an ally of the hackers or as a member of this criminal ring. Never once a journalist, being very careful to lay the foundation with this theory that they're using against Assange, that the CIA wanted to use against me and Laura, to just reclassify us. And now suddenly you're not a journalist in the government's eyes and you have no protection, so you can go to prison for reporting. It's an incredibly menacing theory. It's why the imprisonment of Julian Assange is the greatest threat to press freedom by far over the last 5 years, certainly infinitely more dangerous than, say, mean tweets by Donald Trump about Jim Acosta or Chuck Todd. And yet the media essentially ignored this story, this news story, is ignoring the imprisonment of Assange, largely for the same reason that we just got done talking about, which is Julian never wanted a job with them either. And they know that he's broken more big stories than all of them combined. So he's constantly a mirror that is held up that shows them that what they pretend to be is not in fact what they are, that Julian is that, which is why the CIA targeted him. And, I think that it just shows that this fraud that the media does of pretending to care about press freedom is just so, such a pretense, because when there's true threats to press freedom, like the CIA targeting people like me and Laura and what they plotted to do to Julian, they don't actually care.
No, not at all, which is amazing. No, when you say a threat, so what they're doing to Julian Assange is a threat to press freedom. I don't think it's a threat anymore. That it's actually what they're doing to press freedom. They've done it. They've made people afraid to publish the crimes of government. And now if you do that, this is what's going to happen to you. So I think it's beyond a threat, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the way that journalists who work at media corporations justify their indifference is by saying, I'm not like him. I'm a real journalist, which is such a fucking joke, right? Because he's actually the one revealing the secrets the government doesn't want people to know, which is what journalism is. And they're the ones calling on the opponents of the government to be censored or imprisoned. But so they tell themselves, I don't have to worry about that. So what I mean by a threat is simply that if they succeed in extraditing him to the U.S. and then prosecuting him under this theory and making this theory that the Bolsonaro government tried to use with me, that the CIA tried to use against Julian back in the Obama years and against me and Laura, of simply calling us something other than journalists, every journalist who does real journalism is going to be endangered by that theory.
And I just want to show people how you responded. You said nobody mindlessly repeats CIA fairy tales like liberals do. The CIA winds them up and their mouths start moving. The article I just showed you, even says the intelligence community knew it had no proof Assange was an agent of Russia. They'll go to their grave insisting otherwise. And I just want to show this video. This is the kind of stuff that you'll only hear from Julian Assange. And he's talking about, well, you say more truth in this 27-second clip than in what most journalists who hate Julian Assange have brought to the public in their entire lifetimes combined. That is why they don't care if he rots in prison. He's a mirror, like you said, constantly reminding them of what they claim to be but are not. And here it is.
Because the goal is not to completely subjugate Afghanistan. The goal is to use Afghanistan to wash money out of the tax bases of the United States, out of the tax bases of European countries, through Afghanistan and back into the hands of a transnational security elite. That is the goal, i.e. the goal is to have an endless war, not a successful war.
And so there he lays it out. They never wanted to have a successful war in Afghanistan. It was to have an endless war, and they had one for 20 years. That's amazing that they were able to pull that off. And you say here about the ACLU, you mentioned they quietly signed on to a letter in February. I didn't know that. 2021, that virtually every other civil liberties and press freedom group signed that urged the Biden DOJ to stop prosecuting Assange and warned of the dangers to press freedom, but Biden has ignored them. So here is Joe Biden and Kamala Harris being just as big of an enemy to the press, journalism, and no one cares. And it's just amazing how you could get in trouble for talking to Tucker Carlson, but they voted for Joe Biden, who is responsible for the current private prison industry, architect of it. He was overseeing all those years of war. Didn't prosecute torture. I mean, every horrible thing you can think of, Joe Biden is. And right now,
let me interject there, because I think sometimes people overlook this part of the story that makes it even so much worse. The Obama administration did really want to prosecute Julian, but concluded there was no legal theory on which they could rely that would allow them to explain why they were prosecuting Julian for publishing these documents, but not The Guardian and the New York Times and El País and other media outlets around the world, which published the same documents in partnership with him. And so they made clear that the only way they could justify prosecuting him is if they found evidence that he actually cooperated with Chelsea Manning in the crimes that were committed in a way that the other outlets didn't, and they never did. They looked everywhere. They convened a grand jury for 2 or 3 years. They aggressively searched, and they found nothing. All he did was what journalists do, which is work with his source, got the documents, and reported them. He never participated in the hacking of those documents. So fast forward to the Trump administration, Mike Pompeo gets into office and makes clear in a speech in 2017 that he is fixated on destroying WikiLeaks. He makes it absolutely clear it is a top priority of him. They indict him. Rick Grenell goes to Ecuador, bullies the Ecuadorian government into withdrawing asylum, allowing the British police to go in and take Julian out of that embassy where he had been under 7 years under protection of asylum from Ecuador, and sent him to prison. And now you have a Democratic administration again, Joe Biden, who was part of the Obama administration, which concluded that it couldn't legitimately prosecute Assange. And yet here now they are. In January, there was a judge who rejected the extradition request of the United States, saying we're not going to extradite him to the U.S. because his mental health and physical health, after everything he's endured, cannot withstand the harshness of American prisons. The Biden administration could have just said, okay, we lost. And that's the end of it. He suffered enough. He's been detained. They didn't do that. They appealed that decision and demanded that he be kept in prison pending the appeal. That's the only reason he's in prison. He was convicted of bail jumping. He got 51 weeks, the maximum he could get. He served that 51 weeks. So the only reason he's in prison is pending a trial or an extradition hearing at the Biden administration's demand. So, Jimmy, what changed? Why did Democrats in 2010 and 2011, 2012 take the position that they could prosecute Julian Assange, but now in 2020 and 2021, they're adamant that he remain in prison? What changed? There's only one thing that changed between those two times. In 2016, Julian did reporting that harmed Hillary Clinton because it reflected poorly on the Democratic National Committee. It exposed corruption by the top 5 DNC officials and forced them all to resign, including Debbie Wasserman Schultz. It proved that the DNC cheated on behalf of Hillary. So the only reason that Democrats now want to prosecute Julian, whereas back then they concluded that they couldn't, is because he reported negatively on the Democrats. It's like being a political prisoner. They're not even punishing him because he exposed war crimes. He had already done that in 2010, and the Democrats concluded they couldn't prosecute him. The only thing that changed is that he reported on Hillary Clinton and her corruption and the corruption of the DNC, and that's why they want him in prison, which makes him a political prisoner. It's not just that they're threatening press freedom, it's that their motives are purely political.
That's, you're right. That's exactly, thanks for reminding everybody that is exactly why they're going after him. And it is like, it's a political prosecution, no doubt about it. He went after the Democratic Party, Hillary Clinton. That you're right. Because Barack Obama certainly wanted to prosecute Julian Assange, but they had concluded that if they did that, they would also have to prosecute the New York Times.
Exactly.
And so that's why they didn't. That was their conclusion. Well, they're still not going to prosecute the New York Times. We know that. But now they're just going to ignore all that. They're going to be, unscrupulous, dishonest enforcers and selective enforcers of law. Well, not even enforcing law, just selective prosecutors of people. And it's not the law they're enforcing. So this is a heartbreaker. And here's the last thing I have loaded in for this segment. You say the U.S. government is slowly suffocating, silencing, and killing someone solely for the crime of reporting documents that every major media outlet in the world determined was newsworthy. And a few in the U.S. corporate press care, and few in the U.S. corporate press care because he's never been in their clique. The herd mentality of U.S. establishment media, it is you can't overstate it.
They're repulsive. They're absolutely. Imagine if the Trump DOJ, at the behest of Mike Pompeo when he was at the CIA, had, instead of prosecuting Julian Assange for publishing classified material, instead prosecuted a New York Times reporter or a Washington Post reporter for having published classified information about Russiagate, which they did all the time, which is also a crime. The uproar would have been deafening. It would have been deafening. It would have been the only thing anyone talked about, and rightfully so. But because it's not someone who works for the New York Times or the Washington Post, but this kind of strange Australian who never wanted to be friends with them, It's not even that they don't give a shit. They support the prosecution.
Yes. they want to see him punished. They want to see him go away. They want people who not only their competitors to be extinguished, they want that guy to be extinguished for sure. We're doing a live Jimmy Dore show in Sacramento, October 3rd. We just added a second show. Plus, we're doing stand-up comedy in Florida, in West Palm Beach, and Dania. And then we're going to Buffalo, Baltimore, Tempe, and Portland. Go to jimmydorecomedy.com for a link for all our tickets.